I thought I was just another patient, until the way she touched my wrist made me feel seen, steady, and undone all at once. The first time I saw her, I wasn't thinking about romance. I was restless, sitting in a too-bright clinic that smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee someone had brewed too long ago. My leg bounced nervously as I waited, trying not to look at the clock, trying not to think about why I was even here. The air hummed with the low buzz of fluorescent lights, and every sound, the shuffle of papers at the reception, the distant squeak of rubber soles, felt louder than it should have. And then she stepped into the doorway. She carried herself with a calm confidence that instantly shifted the atmosphere. Her uniform was simple, clean, but on her it looked dignified, almost graceful. There was a maturity in her posture, the kind that spoke of long hours and heavier responsibilities, but there was also a softness in the curve of her smile. Her eyes found me immediately, assessing without judgment, and for the first time that day, I felt the restlessness pause. "Come on in," she said, her tone warm but efficient. I followed her into the small examination room, my nerves trailing behind me. She moved with a kind of measured rhythm, everything deliberate, but not rushed. She asked me the usual questions, the ones she probably asked a dozen times a day, but there was something in her voice that didn't feel routine. Like she was genuinely listening, even to the small pauses between my words. When she asked me to sit on the exam table, I obeyed, though I couldn't quite relax. My shoulders were tight, my breathing shallow. She noticed. Of course she did. Nurses always notice what patients try to hide. "You need to relax?" she murmured gently, as if coaxing rather than instructing. Her hand reached for my wrist to check my pulse. That's when it happened. The moment her fingers wrapped around my skin, steady and assured, I felt a stillness settle inside me. The coolness of her hand contrasted with the warmth of mine, her touch firm yet careful, like she was balancing strength and tenderness in one simple gesture. For the first time in hours, maybe in days, I felt anchored. And before I could stop myself, the words slipped out, half a joke, half a truth that startled even me. "Only in your hands?" The silence that followed seemed to thicken the air. She raised her head slowly, one eyebrow arched, her lips pressing into a faint, amused curve. There was no reprimand in her expression, only curiosity, as if she wasn't sure whether to dismiss it as nervous humor or let it linger. For me, it lingered. I looked away, pretending to study the medical chart on the wall, but my skin still buzzed where her fingers touched me. The pulse she was measuring wasn't just in my wrist, it was in my chest, faster now, more alive. And though she said nothing, I caught the faintest hint of a smile tugging at her lips before she pulled her hand back. A small shift, subtle enough for anyone else to miss. But I noticed. I always notice. In that quiet moment, I realized something had changed. I wasn't just another patient anymore. The checkup continued, but something unspoken lingered in the air between us after my impulsive words. She hadn't replied, not directly, but the faint curve at the edge of her lips stayed with me, like a secret only the two of us knew. She moved through her tasks with practiced ease, but I found myself watching the small details. The way she smoothed the paper on the counter before writing, the quiet hum she let slip under her breath when reaching for supplies, the calm rhythm of her breathing. Everything about her seemed measured, steady. And yet, every so often, I caught her eyes flicking toward me, quick, almost cautious, as if checking more than just my vital signs. When she reached for the blood pressure cuff, I noticed how close she stood, the faint scent of her perfume threading through the sterile air of the room. It wasn't overwhelming, just a warm, subtle note, like something that belonged to her alone. She slid the cuff over my arm, her fingers brushing against my sleeve before tightening the strap. "Just stay still," she said softly, adjusting the dial. Her tone was professional, but there was something quieter beneath it, almost gentle, almost personal. I sat as still as I could, though inside I wasn't calm at all. The cuff tightened around my arm, but it wasn't the pressure that made my chest tighten. It was the awareness of her standing so near, focused entirely on me. Her gaze was lowered, intent on her task, but I could feel the warmth of her presence as if it had weight. When she finally released the valve, the slow hiss of air filled the silence, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. She noted the numbers without comment, but I swore I saw a flicker of amusement in her eyes, as though she knew perfectly well why my pulse had quickened. We didn't speak of it. Instead, the silence became its own kind of conversation, not empty, not awkward, but charged. Each pause stretched just enough to feel deliberate, as if either of us wanted to rush whatever was unfolding. She reached for a thermometer next, brushing back a loose strand of hair that had slipped across her cheek. The gesture was simple, ordinary, but it caught me, the human side of her, the woman beneath the uniform. I couldn't stop my eyes from lingering. When she noticed, her cheeks colored just slightly, a fleeting warmth against her calm exterior. "Open," she said, holding out the thermometer with a steady hand. I obeyed, but the corners of her mouth twitched, perhaps remembering my earlier remark, perhaps choosing not to address it. As I sat there, waiting, I realized how little either of us had actually spoken. And yet, somehow, I felt I knew more about her in these few quiet moments than I had about people I'd known for years. When the thermometer beeped, she removed it carefully, her fingers grazing my jawline for the briefest second. It was nothing, an accidental touch, routine, but it sent a current through me all the same. Neither of us commented. But when our eyes met again, hers softened, and mine refused to look away. The silence said enough. By the time she set aside the last of her instruments, the room had settled into a quieter rhythm. My nerves had dulled, not because the checkup was over, but because of the way she carried the space, calm, steady, but also human. She leaned lightly against the counter, jotting notes onto her clipboard, and for a moment I allowed myself to simply watch her. The fluorescent light above traced soft highlights across her hair, catching on the few strands that had slipped loose from her bun. She tucked one behind her ear, an absent-minded gesture, but something about it struck me as deeply personal. It wasn't the polished professionalism she wore so well, it was something smaller, truer. "You're not the only one who needs to relax," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence but softer this time, almost confessional. She didn't look at me when she said it, her eyes stayed on the clipboard, her pen tapping lightly against the paper. I tilted my head, caught off guard. "Oh?" She let out a quiet laugh, though it carried more fatigue than amusement. "These shifts, they can be long. You give so much of yourself, and sometimes there's nothing left when you go home." She paused, tapping the pen again before finally setting it down. "It's easier to care for other people than to, remember to care for yourself." Her eyes flicked toward me then, as if gauging how much she'd revealed. And in that glance, I saw the faintest crack in her armor, not weakness, but vulnerability. The kind you don't often see from someone who spends her days holding other people steady. I nodded slowly, unsure if I should speak. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like she was offering me a piece of herself, something she didn't hand out lightly. "That sounds lonely," I said finally. My voice came out softer than I intended, almost a whisper, but the weight of the words hung between us. Her lips curved into the smallest smile, though her eyes stayed serious. "Sometimes it is." She folded her arms across her chest, leaning back against the counter, her posture a little less guarded now. "But that's just life, isn't it? We all learn to live with what we have." The room felt different suddenly. Smaller. Not because of the walls, but because of the way the space between us had closed without either of us moving. Her vulnerability pulled me toward her, even though I stayed rooted on the exam table. I watched her tuck another loose strand of hair behind her ear, her fingers brushing her cheek, and I wondered how many times she'd hidden moments like this from the people around her. "I don't think you should have to get used to it," I said, surprising myself. "Everyone deserves someone who notices when they're tired. Someone who sees them." Her eyes lifted to mine, steady now, unreadable but intent. For a heartbeat, either of us moved. The air between us felt like a drawn breath, suspended, waiting. And then she smiled, small and fleeting, before reaching for the clipboard again. "You're observant," she said, her tone light but her voice softer than before. Maybe it was only a sliver of honesty she had given me, but it felt like more. Like I had glimpsed the woman behind the uniform, and I couldn't stop wanting to see more. The checkup should have ended there. She had my numbers, my answers, my chart filled neatly with her practiced handwriting. But neither of us seemed eager to declare it finished. The air felt heavy with all the things unsaid, and I found myself reluctant to break whatever fragile thread had formed between us. She glanced at me, her eyes sharp but softened by something gentler, curiosity, maybe. Or recognition. "You're a little tense still," she murmured, stepping closer. Her tone had shifted again, less clinical, more personal. I shrugged, attempting a smile. "I'm not the best at sitting still." Her lips curved slightly. "I noticed." She reached for the stethoscope draped around her neck, motioning for me to sit upright. I obeyed, though every part of me tightened under her gaze. She pressed the cold metal lightly against my chest, her other hand resting on my shoulder for balance. The touch was firm, steady, grounding. But it was the nearness that unraveled me. Her fingers brushed against the edge of my collar as she adjusted it, and for a moment, I felt the warmth of her skin through the thin fabric of my shirt. The faint texture of her uniform brushed my arm when she leaned closer to listen, and suddenly, the sterile exam room felt too small, too intimate. "Breathe in," she instructed, her voice low. I did, but the inhale trembled. Her hand on my shoulder squeezed lightly, as though she noticed. "And out." Her eyes flicked up to mine for the briefest second as I exhaled, and something passed between us, unspoken, undeniable. A closeness neither of us had planned, yet neither of us seemed willing to step back from. She shifted, moving behind me to listen from another angle. I felt the warmth of her presence at my back, the brush of her sleeve against my arm, the faint rustle of fabric as she leaned in. Her hand steadied me once again, this time on my upper back, the pressure subtle but reassuring. And then it happened, a small, clumsy moment that became more than it should have. I slid slightly on the paper-covered table as I adjusted my posture, and instinctively, she reached out, her hand catching my arm to steady me. It was nothing. Just reflex. A nurse ensuring her patient didn't stumble. But the way her fingers wrapped around my forearm, firm, certain, and the way I felt heat rush to the spot where she touched me, it wasn't nothing to me. It was everything. For a moment neither of us moved. Her hand lingered just a heartbeat too long before she let go, and when she did, I almost wished she hadn't. Our eyes met again. This time, the silence was louder than any words. I saw the flicker of hesitation in her gaze, the careful restraint of a woman who knew the weight of boundaries. But beneath it, there was something else too, something she didn't bother to hide this time. I wanted to speak, to break the tension with humor or reassurance, but the words stuck in my throat. So I simply held her gaze, letting the silence say what I couldn't. When she finally stepped back, it was with a quiet exhale, her professionalism returning like a cloak she'd slipped back into. But I knew, and she knew, something had shifted. The touch might have been small, but the closeness lingered, echoing long after her hand had left my arm. The silence after her touch was heavy, almost too heavy, and I could tell she felt it too. She busied herself with the chart again, eyes lowered, pen tapping lightly against the paper in a rhythm that betrayed her distraction. For the first time since I had walked into the room, her composure wavered, just a fraction, but enough for me to notice. I leaned back slightly, watching her. "You know," I said softly, breaking the quiet, "you're very good at this." Her head lifted, eyes narrowing with cautious amusement. "At what? Taking blood pressure? Listening to heartbeats?" I smiled. "At making people feel calm." Her lips parted, ready with a reply, but no words came immediately. Instead, she looked at me for a long second, and in her eyes, I caught something I hadn't before: hesitation. Not because she disagreed, but because the compliment touched closer than she expected. "I don't know about that," she said finally, her tone light but her voice quieter. She set the pen down with deliberate care, as if it might otherwise slip from her fingers. I tilted my head, studying her. You don't give yourself enough credit. The smallest flicker of color rose in her cheeks, betraying her otherwise steady expression. She tried to deflect with humor. You're just saying that because you're the patient and I'm the one holding the needles. I chuckled, but shook my head. No. I meant what I said earlier. Her brows lifted slightly, though she tried to keep her face neutral. Earlier? The memory flashed between us, her hand on my wrist, my impulsive words. Only in your hands? For a moment, the room felt too still. Her gaze dipped, and she exhaled slowly, the faintest smile tugging at her lips as if she couldn't help it. You have a dangerous way of saying things, she murmured. Dangerous? I asked, my voice low. Her eyes met mine again, steady but softened. Because you say them like you mean them. I didn't look away. That's because I do. There it was. Out in the open, no longer something we could pretend was just nerves or humor. The weight of my words hung between us, and I saw the conflict flicker across her face, the practiced caution of a professional, the careful walls of someone who'd lived long enough to know better. But beneath that restraint, I saw something else, the faint spark of being seen. Not just as a nurse in a uniform, not as the steady professional who held everything together, but as a woman. She broke the gaze first, her hand brushing against her neck as though to ground herself. You shouldn't say things like that, she whispered, but the softness in her tone betrayed her. It wasn't scolding. It was acknowledgement. I leaned forward slightly, not enough to cross the invisible line between us, but close enough that my voice carried only to her. I can't help it. Her breath caught, subtle, almost imperceptible, and in that instant, the tension sharpened. Neither of us moved, either of us dared, but everything in the room felt drawn tight, suspended, waiting for what might come next. And though she didn't say it, I could see it in her eyes. Part of her wanted to hear more. The words I'd spoken, I can't help it, lingered between us like an echo either of us could silence. She stood with her back half turned to me, hands busying themselves with tools that no longer needed rearranging. It was her way of buying time, of composing herself. But her shoulders told the truth, the faint rise and fall of uneven breaths, the smallest stiffness in her posture. Finally, she set the instruments down, her fingers lingering on the counter before she turned back toward me. Her eyes found mine with a weight that seemed to press the room smaller. You shouldn't look at me like that, she said softly. I swallowed, unsure if it was a warning or a plea. How am I looking at you? Her lips parted, then pressed together again, as though she had no easy answer. She walked closer, stopping just in front of me, her clipboard abandoned entirely now. For a moment, her gaze dropped to the floor, then to my hands resting on my lap, before returning to my eyes. It's been a long time since anyone saw me. Her voice cracked just slightly, quickly covered with a steadier tone. Most people see the uniform. The role. The one who fixes, who listens, who holds everything together. They don't see. She trailed off, as though saying more would make her too vulnerable. I leaned forward gently, not to close the distance recklessly but to assure her of my sincerity. I do see you, I said. The words felt heavy in my chest, because they weren't just words, they were the truth. Her eyes shimmered with something I couldn't name, part doubt, part longing. Slowly, almost cautiously, she reached out and rested her hand on my forearm. The touch was tentative at first, the faint tremor in her fingers betraying nerves she never let anyone witness. The moment her skin touched mine, I covered her hand with my own, instinctively. The warmth of her palm, the softness of her skin against my arm, was enough to send a rush through me. But more than that, it was the courage of the gesture, the quiet confession carried in such a small act. I've spent years convincing myself I don't need this, she admitted, her voice low, barely more than a whisper. That I don't need anyone to hold me, or notice me, or make me feel wanted. She hesitated, her thumb brushing lightly over the fabric of my sleeve. But the truth is, I do. Her vulnerability hit me harder than anything else could. There was no performance in it, no careful shield, just raw honesty. I tightened my hand gently over hers, grounding her in the same way she had grounded me earlier. "You deserve to feel wanted," I murmured. "And not just for the way you take care of everyone else. For who you are." Her breath caught, her lips parting as though to respond, but no words came. Instead, she let her hand remain under mine, her fingers curling slightly as if to hold on. In that moment, the world outside the small exam room ceased to exist. It was just us, two people sitting too close, holding on too long, either ready to let go. And though either of us said the word aloud, I knew it. This was no longer about patient and nurse. This was about something far deeper, far riskier, and far more real. Time seemed to stretch inside that little room. The hum of the overhead lights, the faint creak of the chair beneath me, even the muffled footsteps outside the door, all of it faded beneath the quiet rhythm of her hand beneath mine. Neither of us spoke, but the silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything we'd confessed without words, everything we'd admitted in touches and glances. Eventually, she drew in a slow breath and eased her hand from beneath mine. For a moment, I feared the distance returning, the curtain of professionalism falling back into place. But instead of stepping away, she let her hand trail lightly down my arm, her fingers brushing until they slipped away near my wrist. The gesture was soft, deliberate, not an ending, but a pause. "I should let you go," she said gently, though her tone betrayed hesitation. I stood slowly, almost reluctant, as if moving too quickly might shatter the fragile understanding between us. "Do you want to?" I asked quietly. Her eyes lifted to mine, steady but softened. For a heartbeat, she didn't answer. Then she shook her head, almost imperceptibly, and a small smile tugged at her lips. "No," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. We walked together down the narrow hallway, her steps slowing just enough to match mine. Neither of us hurried. Our shoulders brushed once, lightly, and neither of us pulled away. At the end of the hall, where the door opened into the cool evening air, she paused. I turned to face her, the glow of the hallway light casting a faint halo around her hair. The world outside was dim, the air sharp with the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. For a moment, I just looked at her, committing to memory the curve of her cheek, the tired gentleness of her eyes, the quiet strength she carried even in her stillness. "Thank you," I said softly. "Not just for today, but for letting me see you." Her expression shifted, a mixture of surprise, gratitude, and something unguarded that she seemed too careful to name. Slowly, she reached out, her fingers grazing mine before slipping into my hand fully. The contact was simple, natural, as if our hands had been meant to find each other all along. The warmth of her palm spread through me, grounding and electric all at once. She held my gaze, and in that silence, her thumb brushed lightly over the back of my hand, a tender affirmation, quiet but sure. She leaned in, not hurried, not unsure, but with a kind of calm resolve. Her cheek brushed mine, the faint warmth of her skin against me, and she whispered, "Take care of yourself." It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't a promise of forever. But it was real, intimate, and heavy with everything left unspoken. A beginning disguised as a goodbye. When we finally stepped apart, her hand lingered in mine just a moment longer before she let go. But even as I walked into the night, I could still feel it, the warmth, the weight, the promise of her touch. And I knew this wasn't the end. It was the start of something neither of us had expected, but both of us needed. For